There's something strangely painful about missing someone you're not even speaking to anymore. Not dramatic pain, not movie pain, the quiet kind. The kind that slips into ordinary moments, when you're standing in line for coffee, driving home, staring at your phone for no reason at all, and suddenly, there he is, again. And maybe what unsettles you most isn't that he's on your mind, it's that you don't fully understand why. Because logically, you already told yourself the story. It's over. We stopped talking. Nothing is happening. So why does your mind keep reopening a door you thought you closed? And before we go any deeper, if something in you already feels uncomfortable hearing this, like someone quietly walked into a room in your mind you've kept locked for a while, stay with me. Maybe subscribe. Maybe come back for conversations like this. Not because anyone needs another channel in their life, but because sometimes being understood changes the way you understand yourself. Now, I want to tell you something difficult. Sometimes when a man is constantly on your mind and you're not talking, it has very little to do with him. I know, that sounds almost offensive at first, because your brain immediately says, "No, you don't understand. It's him, his voice, his energy, what happened between us." Maybe, but maybe not entirely. You see, people don't just live inside memory, they live inside unfinished emotion. And unfinished emotion is persuasive, terrifyingly persuasive. Your mind hates uncertainty, it hates emotional loose ends. It wants patterns completed, stories resolved, tension explained. So when someone mattered, even quietly, and things stopped without emotional clarity, your brain keeps revisiting the scene like a detective who refuses to leave the crime board. What did I miss? Did he care? Was it real? Did I ruin something? Did he move on? Why do I still care? And here's the strange thing. You can miss someone and not actually miss them. You can crave closure and mistake it for love. You can replay emotional intensity and mistake it for connection. That part is uncomfortable. Because sometimes what you miss isn't the person. It's the version of yourself that existed around them. The hopeful version. The emotionally awake version. The version of you who checked his name on your screen and felt your stomach shift a little. You miss anticipation. You miss possibility. You miss the emotional electricity. And loneliness, real loneliness, is sneaky. Not loneliness as in, I have nobody. Loneliness as in, no one currently reaches that hidden emotional room inside me. That loneliness can make memory feel romantic. Suddenly, the late-night conversations feel deeper than they were. The silences feel meaningful. The mixed signals become mysterious instead of confusing. Your mind edits, softens, curates. Because memory is not objective. Memory protects meaning. And if you're a man watching this alone tonight, wondering why one woman won't leave your head despite silence stretching between you, I want to ask you something quietly. When you think about her, what feeling arrives first? Not the story, the feeling. Regret? Longing? Curiosity? Anger? Comfort? Shame? Because that feeling, that first emotional ache, usually tells the truth long before your thoughts do. And sometimes the truth is harder than, I miss her. Sometimes the truth sounds more like, I miss who I thought I could become with her. Or, I never got to find out what this really was. Or maybe, if we're being painfully honest, I'm still waiting for an answer she never actually promised me. Because silence does something dangerous. Silence gives imagination too much room. And imagination can keep someone alive in your emotional world long after reality stopped speaking. You know what nobody really admits about emotional attachment? Sometimes it becomes stronger after communication ends. Not weaker, stronger. Because reality stops updating and imagination takes over. When you're actively talking to someone, you're reacting to facts, their actual behavior, their timing, their words, their inconsistencies, their humanity. But when contact disappears, your mind fills the silence with interpretation. And interpretation is emotional gasoline. Especially for men who feel deeply but rarely say it out loud. A lot of men don't process attachment in real time. They process it afterward, weeks later, months later, in silence. while working, driving, lying awake at 1:17 in the morning staring at the ceiling for absolutely no reason they can explain. And that delayed emotional processing can feel confusing because on the surface, life still looks normal. You're functioning, laughing at things, answering messages, going to the gym maybe, going to work, talking to people. But underneath, there's this low, constant mental return, like your mind keeps touching the same bruise just to check if it still hurts. And maybe what bothers you most is this. You don't even know if she thinks about you anymore. That uncertainty can become addictive, not because you enjoy pain, but because the brain gets hooked on incomplete emotional loops. Psychologists sometimes talk about something called intermittent reinforcement, and honestly, it explains more modern relationships than people realize. It's when emotional rewards come inconsistently, not steady affection, not clear rejection, just enough connection, enough attention, enough chemistry, enough possibility to keep the mind invested. That dynamic creates obsession far more easily than stable love does, because certainty relaxes the nervous system, uncertainty activates it. That's why the people who confuse us often stay in our minds longer than the people who loved us clearly. And I think some men secretly hate hearing that, because they want their feelings to mean something pure, something profound. But emotional intensity is not always emotional compatibility. Sometimes it's anxiety wearing the mask of passion. Sometimes you're not haunted by the connection, you're haunted by the ambiguity. There's a difference, a huge difference. I once spoke to a man who told me he couldn't stop thinking about a woman he hadn't spoken to in almost a year. A year. And when I asked him what exactly he missed about her, he went silent for a long time. Then he finally said, "I think I miss how important I felt when she wanted me." That answer stayed with me, because underneath most obsessive thinking is not romance, it's identity. Who were you in that person's eyes? Desired, chosen, interesting, safe, powerful, seen? Some connections attach themselves directly to self-worth. So when the connection disappears, it doesn't just feel like losing a person, it feels like losing access to a version of yourself. That's why moving on isn't always about getting over someone. Sometimes it's grieving an identity, and men rarely allow themselves to grieve emotionally in honest ways. They distract, they minimize, they intellectualize. They tell themselves, "It wasn't serious, we barely dated, it's not a big deal." Meanwhile, she's still crossing their mind every single day, not because they're weak, because unresolved emotion does not disappear simply because you refuse to name it. And here's where this gets even more uncomfortable. Sometimes you keep thinking about someone because part of you believes the story isn't over yet, even if reality says otherwise. You replay conversations, analyze tiny moments, wonder if certain things meant something. Your mind starts searching for hidden evidence that the emotional connection was mutual and unfinished. Because closure feels unbearable when hope is still alive, even tiny hope, especially tiny hope. That's the cruel thing about emotionally significant people. They don't always leave loudly, sometimes they fade quietly, while still occupying enormous space inside your inner world. And the man experiencing this usually tells himself one lie over and over. If I still think about her this much, it must mean something. But thoughts alone don't always reveal truth. Sometimes they reveal hunger, emotional hunger. And hunger has a way of turning memories into mythology. There's a moment that happens to a lot of men after someone emotionally significant disappears from their life. It usually happens late at night, not during the day when everything is loud and distracting. At night, when the performance stops, when there's nobody to impress, nobody to respond to, nowhere left to mentally run. And suddenly, there she is again. Not even necessarily as a person, more like a feeling, a presence, a question. And what makes it worse is that the memory often arrives softened. You remember the warmth before the confusion, the chemistry before the distance, the potential before the disappointment. Your mind rarely replays the entire truth at once. It edits emotionally. That's what memory does when attachment is involved. It protects emotional significance. And sometimes, if we're honest, you help it. Because there's comfort in preserving someone as emotionally special, even when reality became painful. You know what I've noticed? A lot of men become attached not to what a relationship was, but to what it almost became. That word almost ruins people quietly. Almost together, almost understood, almost chosen, almost loved in the way they needed. There's something psychologically brutal about almost, because the brain struggles to mourn possibilities. There's no concrete ending to hold on to, no full collapse, no undeniable conclusion, just open space. And open space invites fantasy. You start imagining alternate timelines. If I had said this differently, if timing were better, if I had been more confident, if she knew how much I cared. The mind starts negotiating with reality, not because you're irrational, because regret is the mind trying to regain control over emotional helplessness. That's all regret really is sometimes, an attempt to rewrite vulnerability into strategy. But here's the part many men never say out loud. Sometimes the person constantly on your mind represents emotional safety more than actual compatibility. That's difficult to admit, especially if the emotional connection felt intense. But intensity can come from many places: loneliness, projection, timing, need, fantasy, unmet emotional wounds. And sometimes, two people emotionally recognize each other without actually being healthy for each other. That happens more than people think. You can deeply affect someone and still not belong together. You can feel emotionally understood by someone who would eventually hurt you. You can crave someone who activated parts of you that had been asleep for years. And honestly, that's what makes certain people unforgettable. Not perfection, activation. They wake something up. Maybe confidence, maybe desire, maybe emotional openness, maybe the terrifying hope that love is still possible for you. And once someone touches those hidden emotional places, your mind associates them with aliveness itself. So after they're gone, life can feel emotionally flatter. Not because nobody else exists, but because your nervous system remembers what it felt like to feel deeply again. That's why men sometimes return mentally to women they barely even had a real relationship with. People judge that harshly from the outside, but psychologically it makes sense. The brain is not measuring time, it's measuring emotional impact. A 3-month connection can affect someone more deeply than a 10-year relationship if it touched unresolved emotional needs. Especially men who spent years emotionally disconnected from themselves. And there's another layer nobody talks about enough. Sometimes you think about her constantly because she saw a version of you that you've hidden from everyone else. The softer version, the uncertain version, the emotionally honest version. Maybe she saw through your control a little. Maybe around her, you stopped performing masculinity for a second, stopped pretending you had everything figured out. That kind of emotional exposure leaves a mark. Because being truly seen is rare. Terrifying, but rare. And when that connection disappears before it fully stabilizes, the nervous system keeps searching for it again. Not necessarily for her, for the feeling, the recognition, the emotional mirror. But be careful here, because sometimes what feels like destiny is actually unresolved emotional deprivation finally being touched for the first time in years. And a starving heart will mistake relief for permanence very quickly. Let me say something a little uncomfortable but important. Not every thought about her is meaningful. I know that sounds almost dismissive at first, but stay with me. Because one of the most common mental traps men fall into is believing that frequency equals significance. If I think about her this much, she must matter this much. But the mind doesn't work like a fair scale. It works like a spotlight. And whatever has unresolved emotional charge gets illuminated again and again, not because it's important in the present, but because it was never fully processed in the past. There's a difference, a big one. Sometimes she's not the one who got away. Sometimes she's the one your nervous system never got closure with. And closure isn't always about conversation. It's about emotional completion. Your body doesn't always care that the story logically ended. It cares whether the emotional loop resolved. That's why you can understand something intellectually and still feel stuck emotionally. And men, especially, are taught to prioritize understanding over feeling. So they explain things to themselves. She wasn't consistent. She probably wasn't that interested. It wasn't aligned. And those statements might even be true, but they don't automatically settle the emotional system. Because emotion doesn't respond to logic the way we wish it would. It responds to experience. And experience is slower, more stubborn, more human. So the mind keeps returning, not because it wants pain, but because it's trying to finish something that never got finished. There's also another dynamic that rarely gets spoken about honestly. Sometimes you miss someone because your life felt different with them in it. Not necessarily better, different. There was anticipation, a sense of being emotionally awake. Even uncertainty can feel alive compared to emotional numbness. And if you've been emotionally flat for a while, just going through routines, responsibilities, pressure, expectations, your mind will sometimes cling to the last moment you felt activated. Even if that activation came with confusion, even if it wasn't healthy, even if it wasn't stable. The brain doesn't always prioritize peace. It prioritizes stimulation. That's a hard truth. And it explains why some men end up idealizing women they were never truly at peace with. Because peace feels quiet. And quiet doesn't always register as emotionally significant in hindsight. Now let's go a layer deeper. Sometimes what keeps her in your mind is not love. It's unfinished self-questioning. You're not just thinking about her, you're thinking about you in relation to her. What you said, what you didn't say, how you acted, how you wish you acted. And slowly, she becomes the emotional center of an internal trial. You're not just remembering a person, you're evaluating yourself. That's why the thought loop feels heavy. Because it's not only about missing, it's about self-perception. And here's where it becomes tricky. If you don't consciously interrupt that loop, your mind starts to believe that solving her equals solving you. If I understand what she meant, I'll understand what I meant. If I figure out what happened, I'll feel better about myself. But emotional healing doesn't come from decoding another person. It comes from reclaiming your attention from the story. Because the more you replay it, the more authority it gains in your inner world. And slowly, she stops being a person in memory and becomes a mental habit, a reflex, a place your mind goes when it's bored, lonely, uncertain, or emotionally unstimulated. And I want you to hear this clearly. A mental habit can feel like emotional destiny if you repeat it long enough. That's the trap. Not love. Repetition. So the real question isn't always, why can't I stop thinking about her? Sometimes the better question is, what part of me keeps reopening this loop when nothing new is actually being said? Because if nothing new is being added, then what you're experiencing is not discovery. It's repetition dressed as meaning. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. There's a quieter layer to this whole experience that men rarely talk about, even to themselves. It's not just that she's on your mind, it's that part of you feels slightly altered because of her. Like something shifted in your emotional baseline and you didn't fully notice it happening until later. You go through your day and everything looks the same on the outside. Same routines, same responsibilities, same conversations. But internally, there's this subtle comparison happening in the background, and she becomes the reference point. Not because she's present, but because she's unresolved. That's how the mind builds anchors. And emotional anchors are powerful because they don't need current contact to stay active. They live in contrast. You start measuring present moments against a past emotional intensity, even if that intensity wasn't stable or sustainable. And slowly, without realizing it, your present life can start feeling emotionally thinner than your memory of her. Not necessarily because it is thinner, but because memory has been edited by longing. And longing is selective. It highlights emotional peaks and blurs emotional friction. You remember the way she looked at you at a certain moment, the way her presence felt different from others, the unpredictability that made your attention sharpen. And your mind quietly removes the parts where things didn't align, where communication was unclear, where you felt uncertain. where you were trying to interpret instead of relax. That's not dishonesty, that's attachment shaping perception. But here's what I want you to notice carefully. Sometimes what keeps someone mentally alive in you is not their character. It's the emotional state they triggered in you. There are people who awaken calm, and there are people who awaken intensity. And intensity is louder in memory, even when it wasn't healthier, especially when it wasn't healthier, because the nervous system confuses activation with importance. And if someone consistently activated your emotional system, hope, anxiety, anticipation, confusion, desire, your brain stores them as significant. Not necessarily right, significant. There's also something else that happens in silence. Silence gives your mind space to assign meaning where there might not be any. A delayed reply becomes a signal. A small moment becomes a clue. A brief connection becomes a story. And eventually you're not remembering what actually happened. You're remembering your interpretation of what could have happened. And I need to be careful here, because this is where a lot of men start to suffer unnecessarily. They begin to treat emotional ambiguity as unfinished destiny. But ambiguity is not destiny, it's just lack of information. And lack of information is uncomfortable for a mind that wants certainty. So it fills in the gaps. And those gaps are usually filled with hope, or regret, or both. There's a particular kind of emotional pain that comes when you realize you were more invested in potential than reality, because potential feels almost sacred in hindsight. It feels like something meaningful was interrupted. But sometimes nothing was interrupted. It simply never fully formed, and the mind struggles to accept that difference, because accepting it means letting go of a story that felt alive inside you. And let's be honest, some men don't miss the person as much as they miss the emotional direction they felt when she was there. The sense that something was unfolding, that something was building, even if it was never clearly defined. When that direction disappears, it can feel like emotional suspension, like your attention has nowhere to land in the same way anymore. And so it returns to her. Not because she is currently shaping your life, but because she once held your emotional attention in a way that felt significant. But here's a truth that's hard to sit with. Not everything that held your attention deserves to keep it. Sometimes attention lingers long after meaning has ended. And part of growth is learning to notice when your mind is revisiting a feeling, not a reality. Because feelings can echo, even when the situation that created them is long gone. If you've made it this far, there's something I want to say to you very directly. Not as a theory, not as psychology on paper, but as something I've seen sit inside real people for a long time. Thinking about someone who is no longer in your life doesn't automatically mean they were meant to stay there. I know how easily the mind wants that conclusion. It feels clean, it feels meaningful, it turns confusion into purpose. But sometimes the truth is simpler, and that simplicity is what makes it hard to accept. Sometimes someone stays in your thoughts because your emotional system hasn't fully adjusted to their absence yet. Not because they are actively connected to your present life, but because your inner world hasn't updated to match reality. That delay can feel like significance, but it's often just adjustment, and adjustment takes time. There's also something deeper that I want you to consider, especially if you're a man who tends to process things privately. You may not just be thinking about her. You may be revisiting a version of yourself that existed around her. A more emotionally open version, a more uncertain version, a version that felt something strongly, maybe in a way you don't always allow yourself to now. And when people leave, what often lingers isn't only their presence, it's access to that emotional version of you. So you keep returning mentally, not because you're stuck on her, but because part of you hasn't fully made peace with losing that version of yourself in the process. That's a subtle grief, and it doesn't always announce itself clearly. It shows up as repetition, as thought loops, as quiet emotional pull in moments where nothing is happening externally. But here's the part I really want you to hear without turning it into pressure or self-judgment. You don't have to solve every emotional loop to move forward. Some loops fade not because you decode them perfectly, but because you stop feeding them constant attention. Not by force, not by suppression, but by slowly returning your mind to what is actually present in your life right now. Because present life is quieter than memory at first. It doesn't have the same emotional intensity. It doesn't give you instant meaning, but it is where your attention belongs. And attention, over time, decides what grows inside you. So if she's been on your mind, constantly, quietly, persistently, it doesn't mean you're broken. It means something in you got activated and your mind hasn't fully settled yet. That's human, but it's not permanent, and it doesn't need to become your identity. You can let someone exist as a memory without turning them into a mental home. You can acknowledge that something mattered without continuing to relive it. And maybe the most important shift isn't forgetting her. It's learning to notice when your mind is choosing the past over the present, and gently, without force, returning, again and again, until the pull weakens not because you fought it, but because it stopped being reinforced. And if there's one final thought I want to leave you with, it's this. Sometimes the mind keeps someone alive far longer than the moment actually required. Not because love is still happening, but because attention hasn't been redirected yet. And when it finally is, you don't feel a dramatic ending. You feel space, quiet, a kind of emotional breathing room you forgot was possible. And in that space, you realize something simple but powerful. You're still here. Your life is still moving, and the story didn't end with one person staying in your thoughts. It just paused long enough for you to understand what your mind was trying to say. Not about her, but about you.